everybody, welcome to New Art Gallery Walsall. So happy to see you all here tonight. It's a real hot ticket. There's plenty more people wanting to come as well. I'm Deborah Robinson, I'm Head of Exhibitions and also the curator of this fantastic show by Mat Collishaw. We're so privileged to be able to show this spectacular body of work by Mat here. And I have to say that we've never had such an overwhelmingly positive response to an exhibition from the national press and also from our visitors. And I think it's real kind of testimony to the strength and the richness and the breadth of Mat's practice. I hope you've all had a really good look around the show, because what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Mat and hand over to him for a moment, and he's going to do a bit of a virtual tour of the gallery. Obviously there's far too many of you to be wandering around with us, so we're going to talk through the exhibition. There'll be a chance afterwards to ask any questions that you'd like to ask Mat or any of the rest of the team here, and then we'll mill around for a little bit longer. But thank you so much for coming, and it is my absolute privilege to introduce you to Mat Collishaw.
Thank you. It seems a little bit rude to sit down. Do you think I need the microphone? Probably, yeah? Okay, right, I'll carry on using it. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to New Art Gallery Walsall for having me here originally. This exhibition was planned possibly a couple of years ago, since we very first started working on it, and it's not all down to me by any means. We had a lot of different ideas of how it could be and different works that we were going to include in the show. And we started making lists, and then I built like a little scale model out of foam board and started sticking little pictures in it. And we started trying to find where all the works were and if we could get them back into the country and to Walsall for the show. And then trying to make a body of work that all fitted together. Some of the works we couldn't really get hold of because it's like too expensive to bring them from Georgia, for example. And so a lot of input came from Deborah and other people in the Walsall team. Eventually we decided on a definitive list of works and then tried to find a way that they would all work together inside this space. That involved basically moving these little pictures around inside the little model I built and then talking to Deborah and the guys at Walsall about it and seeing whether that would work. And a lot of problems arose through things like electrical cabling or light traps, different practical issues that we had to solve to make everything work together. So it wasn't just a case of this work looks good next to that work, it's just that it wouldn't function in that order because of certain technical reasons. There's a lot of little problems that came up which you guys were great at solving for me. Anyway, so this is the layout that we finalized in a little model, and it looks, I have to say, pretty much identical to the little simulation that I'd made. Strange to see it come into life, that little doll's house with all the little pictures and objects in it suddenly being here for real. So as we were doing this, we were thinking about the ideal route to take as you walk through and experience these different rooms with the different works one by one. So in my ideal route, you'd start from a lift and then you come into the little room here, work through this room, into the room on my left, and then through into the main room and then upstairs. So that's the order I'll go through and just talk a little bit about each work. And things that I might say about the works you might have heard before. If you've heard anything I've said, I might be repeating myself, so I apologize to that. But I might say a few different things because sometimes different works have different meanings. Even for me, I'll like wake up a different day, and every day you kind of feel a little bit different about different things. Your perception of the world changes a little bit. And it's the same thing with artworks. And often when I've made a work, I'm not really sure what it's about. I've just got an intuition that it should be that thing and it should be done in that way. And it's not till like years later that I think, okay, what it might have been about was this, and maybe I'll make a different work on that subject because it seems to be a preoccupation of mine. So different things occur to me at different times at work. It's never about one specific thing that I try and make a work about. I try and get several different ingredients and mix it into my menu and make some kind of concoction that absorbs all those ingredients that complement each other. So in the first room here is a series of photographs called Last Meal on Death Row. And initially I'd seen images of the Last Meal on Death Row in, I think it was the Sunday Times from about 20 years ago. And they were photographs taken from above. It was like kind of a red plastic tray with cheeseburger, chicken wings. And they were in full colour with a flash. So they're very brash, bold pictures. But although they were of these very mundane foodstuffs, they had this strange charge to them. And I thought I'd love to try and do something with that subject. It seems really just so odd. And it took me like 20 years to come up with the idea of restaging them and then rephotographing them as still life paintings, either Spanish or Dutch still life paintings from the 17th century. So I started doing a lot of research, and I bought a few books and then went online and did a lot of cross-referencing to find out who did what and who ate what, and compiled like a dossier. And then every night when I went to bed, I'd have this dossier and I'd just go through making little annotations so that I got a good spectrum of the meals that were chosen, because often they were quite repetitive. A lot of people asked for the same things. A lot of African American food, a lot of Mexican food, by far the biggest bias in menus on death row, sadly. As well as that, there were a lot of people who seemed to be choosing food that was probably quite comforting, something they remember from a better time. There's a lot of children's food, such as like ice cream or breakfast cereals, comfort eating kind of stuff, which is also quite sad to see. So the first series that I made was of 13 of these images. I chose 13 because it was like Jesus at the Last Supper with 12 disciples. And I restaged the images that I'd chosen, various different subjects, lit them with a very soft light through a very small hole on one side, trying to emulate this Dutch still life tradition, and then frame them in these kind of heavy black, very sober frames. And I wanted to make works that were essentially depictions of very everyday, mundane foods, such as chicken bucket or pizza and Coca-Cola and stuff, but to make them so that you look at them in the way that you would look at vanitas paintings. So you're thinking about the transience of life and the meaningless accumulation of worldly goods, and essentially about mortality, which is what a lot of these paintings were about. So in my pictures, you're looking at a packet of cheesy doodles with a Diet Coke, but you're thinking about mortality, because these things were the last request by the prisoner before they're executed. And I wanted them to also have something about them which referred to that quite a chilling notion that we were being, in a way, civilized about presenting this offer to these people that were about to be executed. So we're going to kill somebody, but we're going to do it in a civilized way, and that means that they will deliver them their choice of last meal. And there was something about that which I think was particularly poignant, which made me want to make these works. So the idea was to make essentially like surrogate portraits of these prisoners through a depiction of the meal that they'd chosen before they're executed. So that there'd be like these kind of black slabs that are hung on the wall and illustrated this choice they had. I've shown them a few times before, and generally in the room I've painted the walls like a kind of a grey, which is a kind of a farrow and ball type grey, but it's also a kind of grey that you find in a lot of prisons. So, I mean, grey, when you're in a prison, is a totally different, the colour has a totally different meaning than it does on a farrow and ball chart when you're picking something for your house in Islington. So I was kind of a little bit interested in that as well, the way that in an art gallery everything looks kind of nice and sober and tasteful, but that grey in a different context is like harsh, and it's robbing you of colour. There's no colour in there. There's no white, there's no black, it's grey. So that's pretty much what was going on in that room there. And this is the next room which we planned. And this is kind of probably the most difficult room to curate because there are a lot of different works in here. This was like the kind of lucky bag of different works which we had to try and make work together. The work on my right over there, which is the burning flower in the Gothic altarpiece, I've made photographs of burning flowers for years anyway. It's just like a cheap and easy way of making a picture which I thought was evocative in some way. I'd just get some flowers from the flower market and spray them with the cheapest hairspray I could find. The cheaper the hairspray, the better it burns. It's more flammable. And then photograph them and make these pictures. And I didn't really know why I was doing this thing, but it just seemed kind of quite a strong image, and obviously it has something to do with desire. I mean, consumed with desire, and the fact that these things are being destroyed in the process of being burned, but they take on a certain power by harnessing the flower and working together in the image. And then I started animating them and making images of flowers opening and closing with the petals burning as they did it. And I realized that it possibly had something to do with depictions of suffering in paintings that I'd seen, particularly the most prevalent one in Western art is Christ on the cross with the two thieves. It's an image that is in a lot of museums and galleries around the world, and it's also like a kind of a little sculpture or painting that a lot of people have hanging above their beds. And essentially it's an image of torture and suffering, but people feel kind of okay about hanging it above their bed, whereas obviously they wouldn't have that if it was just a photograph of somebody being decapitated in Syria nowadays. But it's not that different. It's suffering and humiliation and demonstration by certain people, setting an example of murdering somebody in a very graphic form to make an image, to burn that image onto people's mind. And now that it's become adopted as like the symbol of Christianity, it's an image that's become about redemption and salvation, and something that people get a lot of solace out of looking at. So in a way, it was something similar to that going on in this image, which is why I tried to reframe it in this Gothic altarpiece, that it's just an image of suffering and being consumed by something, but at the same time being potent as an image, and being something that was strong despite the fact that it was being under attack in some way. And the choice of Gothic over various other religious styles was basically about the fact that the Gothic tradition seems to be about trying to generate that feeling of awe and emotion within you. It's all about giving you that kind of chill of the unknown and the almighty, of those things that you can't really you can't really deal with. It's a tradition in design and architecture that's designed to intimidate you and to stimulate your emotions, something that kind of was developed in literature as well. It's just all about being a bit spine-tingly. It's about emotional manipulation in some kind of way. So that was the framework that I decided might be appropriate for that particular subject. And this one here behind me was in the same exhibition when I first showed them, so a similar kind of thing. It's not Gothic, but it's another altarpiece that I got from an architectural salvage yard. And in this one, it's also like a little bit of a similar subject. It's a pole dancer. It's the same girl in each image, this central one here is the main image, and then on the side is the same image which I've flipped either way, so it becomes kind of like Christ and the two thieves on the cross. And it's similar in a way because you have an audience there that are looking in quite an emotionally detached way at this performance that's happening in front of you, and they're kind of enjoying it, and they're experiencing it without being moved emotionally, particularly, not evidently anyway. And the pole dancer there is like kind of suffering for us. Obviously she's very good at it, and it takes an enormous amount of training and physical fitness to be able to perform like that. And I guess she's probably kind of suffering in a little way to make those contortions of her body isn't easy. So, but it's enjoyable for us to see that person up there performing this act that we can experience and enjoy in a way. Obviously, it's a little bit of a subversion of the typical depiction of the crucifixion, and it's like profane and it's sacrilegious. So it's something that I wanted to do to find a contrast to that image that people normally interpret as being like pure, and to have this reverence for it, something that generally people look down on as being seedy and debased. But maybe it's not so different. Maybe it's a similar thing that's going on when we're looking at these kind of images. So I was trying to bring different fields together and suspend moral judgment on things, and try and make us look at things in a slightly different way. The images down this wall here, they kind of have a little bit of a link to them because they were made when I had this studio in the East End of London. It's quite a poor area in Bethnal Green, and with these pictures here you get a lot of single mothers, teenagers with like little pushchairs going down the street with their little babies. Often it seemed like they were pretty isolated, that they'd like had the kid quite young, and in the evening their mates were probably going out partying. They got the kids, so they've got to stay at home. Their boyfriend left them, so they're just in this situation where they're really quite isolated. And they're there with the kid contemplating the situation that they have to deal with. So I've seen these girls with their kids around. I wanted to make a piece of work about it, and I decided to make it in the style of Georges de la Tour, a painter who made particularly poignant and humble little scenes of people, generally interiors with one candle, and a lot of people just looking at that light, and you get the feeling that they're contemplating something that's quite deep and meaningful for them, and they're kind of lost in a little way. And when you look at these paintings, it's like you're looking at somebody who's like an emotional blank. It's like their mind is elsewhere when you're painting. Those paintings of Georges de la Tour have that quality to them. There's something very detached about those people being lost in another world. So I wanted to restage the pictures of my single mothers with their little babies in that kind of style, just contemplating this little candle that's flickering away, this very humble little light source, and thinking about the situation that they were in. You might notice I make quite a few references to art history, and this one also was a work I've been wanting to make a work about it for a while. It's based on the sculptures and paintings of Romulus and Remus, the old myth where the two twins were raised by wolves, so they were like feral kids. And it just seemed like a strange story, these suckling babies. I was quite interested in feral children anyway, that idea of kids being brought up without any civilization. And it was also through experience in the kind of families that I saw on the estates around my studio, was that you get like certain kids that are basically itinerant. They don't have a lot of parental guidance. They're pretty wild. And their parents, it's debatable how much quality control they have over their kids' experience. There's a lot of Sky Sports down the pub at lunchtime, down the bookies, and the kids are growing up quite wild. But then there's a situation that if the social services get involved in a situation like that, the parents naturally don't want the kids to be taken away from them. So there's a question of whether the social services are right to intervene and to take these kids away from their natural parents, or whether the natural parents, because they are biologically related to their kids, whatever the situation, they have a right to be the guardians of these kids. So they're fiercely protective against the social services to defend their position in like looking after them. So I wanted to make a work that was something about that, and the Robinson Remus subject seemed to be a possible means of doing it. So I got some babies, I got some dogs, I got a sofa, and this is just a technicality, but the way I did it was I photographed the dogs first of all on the sofa in my studio, and I photographed the babies separately on the sofa in the studio, and I dragged the sofa on its own out in the studio onto the street and photographed the sofa on its own, and then I had to collage together all the different elements to make one image, which sounds kind of easy, but I had like 700 images of the babies, same with the dogs. Sofa was pretty much one shot. And I just tried to find a balance where they all seem to kind of work together to make one image, so when you experience it, you're not really aware of all the artifice that went on behind making the image. This work here is another image that I've lifted from art history. It's based on Dührer's, I think it's called The Great Turf. Some people title it differently. Some people call it Great Tuft. And it's probably one of the first ever depictions of something of such a lowly subject matter. Not something that 500 years ago people would be painting pictures of people from religion like popes or priests or wealthy people, mythological subjects, things that were of great interest and had certain political weight to them. And Dürer painted this watercolour in obsessive detail of like nothing. It's just what's going on at the side of the track where you're walking. But he gave attention to every little detail of every little weed and leaf there has been meticulously copied. And I made it when I was in hospital, and melodramatically I thought I was dying. And this image came to my mind. I thought, if I ever get out of this hospital alive, then I'd like to make a piece of work about that little watercolour, because although it's nothing, it's just weeds at the side of the road, it's kind of like everything. It's life. It's just things that grow without you encouraging them to grow. They're just tenacious. They have no need of encouragement. They just want life. They just want to be alive. And then Dürer himself just gave them that kind of the dignity which they have, which we walk by and don't see and don't notice every day. And so I thought, if I came out of hospital, what I'd do is just try and breathe a little bit of life into them and just make them, it's actually frozen as I speak, weirdly. Has that happened before? Oh. That's quite strange. Okay. Breathe
just as we're looking at it,
a bit of life into them to animate them. So what I had to do technically for that one is like rebuild the whole thing on a computer. So every little blade of grass was built as a little simulation, and then you apply a wind current to it, and each little bit of nature in there has a certain resistance to wind, which is programmed in. So like the dock leaves are different from the kind of the grassier stems. And that way you can kind of simulate the way that they would all move in real life. So that was it, just an attempt to like breathe life into this thing, to say that little bit of movement there was kind of like everything, although it was nothing at the same time. And then there's a little photograph at the back on the wall there, which is the oldest work in the show. It's me looking to a little puddle It was something that I made in Finsbury Park when I used to live there for a while, and there's like a kind of very grubby council estate with some building work going on. There's a dirty little puddle, and I made a picture of myself as Narcissus looking into this dirty puddle. And I made it with like a camera shutter really, so I set up a tripod with a camera and then photographed myself looking in the puddle. So it's like a self-portrait, but you can't really see me because I'm too absorbed in looking at myself, and I'm so narcissistic that I don't even care that it's not a particularly idyllic environment. I'm like it lying in the mud looking in this shitty little puddle because I'm so absorbed with myself that I'm unaware of the environment that's going on around me, and that looking at myself is kind of mirrored by me actually taking the picture of me through the camera, but that camera can't really see me because it's just me looking at myself in the reflection. So I just wanted to make a work about that self-absorption of people and artists in particular, and also like a little kind of game, a pictorial game. It's like a little paradox within the picture, or that's at least what I hoped it to be. That's what I was trying to make in that little work there. And then next door, this is a work that originally I made in 2007, I think. And I made it, I've been wanting to make a work on this subject for a while because it was a kind of troubling me a little bit. And then this situation happened in Beslan in Russia, where there was a siege at a school, and all these kids were kind of held hostage in the school, and the whole thing took several days to play out, which gave the media time to come down and camp outside. So you got CNN and Sky and Fox, BBC, everyone had their little vans out there with their satellite dishes, and they were filming events as they unfolded and then broadcasting them back to us, and we were watching them on TV as the whole thing unfolded. And it occurred to me that while I was watching it, that I was getting quite addicted to these little news updates, which I think is something that we're probably even more engaged with these days, because like streaming news is something that's far more prevalent now than it was then. And I wanted to make something to do with this kind of addiction we have for those kind of situations, the fact that there's some terrible situation going on, and it doesn't have to be a terrorist attack, it could be a natural disaster, but we're kind of we're engaged and we're charged, and we feel more alive when we see these things unfolding in front of us. And I don't think it's necessary. It seems like it's a very prurient thing to do, to almost take pleasure in other people's suffering. I'm not sure that it is that. I think maybe it stimulates our adrenaline in a similar way to it does people that are actually at that scene, because we're experiencing it from a distance, but we're kind of primed that when we do experience situations that are that extreme, that immediately our adrenaline starts flowing and we feel charged, because it's a situation that evolutionary we've been primed to have the flight or fight mechanism, what we're going to do in that situation. But maybe that feeling of being more alive is something that we like, so we actually tune into these horrible situations as they're being played out, because it makes us feel more alive. Anyway, there's something that made me feel a little bit dubious about that whole subject matter, so I wanted to make a piece of work that addressed it. And I went through various different ways of making it happen, and this is the way that I finished after about a year of experimentation. So what I did was to re-photograph people in a studio running towards my camera, and they had like ash on them and dirt on them, and I had like a smoke machine, and I'd like took hundreds of photographs and then selected 45 and then had them etched onto little gobos, which are like little glass slides which go in the projectors which are hanging from the rig in there, and they're lights that generally they're used for like stage shows, theatres, rock concerts and stuff, and they're good because you can program them to move wherever you want them, so you can shine them on one wall, 3 seconds, move them around and get them to do pretty much whatever you want. So I installed them inside these projectors, and then I painted all the walls in a phosphorescent paint, which is basically a glow-in-the-dark paint. So when you shine something on the wall, it charges the wall, and you get like this ghost image coming off. And in the arrangements that I've got, all the images are programmed to burn the image onto the wall. The projectors then move and project a different image onto a different wall. And I wanted to try and replay that thing that was happening, or a thought that was happening in my head when I experienced those things. That you see these images, and they're kind of timeless in a way, because they're the same, or they're very similar images to ones that we've seen in art history of people, like the Pieta, for example, a parent with a child in a situation of distress, or also from like kind of Hiroshima or Nagasaki or from Vietnam. There's these like very startling images which burn themselves onto our retina, and we are moved by them, and we do feel compassion, I think, when we see them. But then these pictures, they kind of possibly fade a little bit from our mind, and then there's another disaster, there's another situation that happens, and there's fresh images that appear and are again burned onto our retina, and then they in turn begin to fade, and then we're ready for the next bout of it. So it's this kind of relentless cyclical barrage of information and images that I wanted to make a work about there. It's like in that particular situation, the kids were running away from the barrel of a gun, and they were running straight down the barrel of a camera, and that image, more so nowadays because of digital technology, is broadcast straight back to us, and we can experience what's happening right there at the time. And it's really quite a disconcerting situation we're living in, when we, in the comfort of our own homes, can experience other people suffering at the other side of the world kind of the same time that it's happening. In the larger room, Gallery 4, I think? Gallery 1, sorry. Over there's two different kinds of work. The butterflies on the wall was something that I started making a long time ago, and initially I started making them because I was having a child, and I just had to clean all the little bugs and stuff out of the flat, make sure it was clean as possible. And I started, you feel a bit bad when you're killing all the little spiders and stuff, doesn't feel right, or you're releasing them outside or whatever, but I started squashing them in these little kind of glass slides, the things that you put in normal carousel slide projectors. And I squashed them in there and then put them in the slide projector and projected them on the wall. And suddenly that little thing, from being an insignificant extinction of life, became this like 12-foot high squashed insect. And not only that, but some of these, like I got a daddy long legs there, and it wasn't quite dead, so the little legs started twitching, and fluids were oozing out of his body, and it's there like a kind of like a Hollywood film kind of proportions, just happening in front of me. And suddenly, like, wow, this is incredibly powerful. It's like nothing, but obviously it's, for that thing, that creature, it's life being snuffed out. So I started making these pictures, and they went through many metamorphoses until they got into the current state, which are the images on the wall here now. So squashing insects, various different ones, and butterflies and moths. And they were kind of similar to the tradition of memento mori, which is like a technique that's interested me for a long time, like early photography, Victorian kind of period, when people would make images of the recently deceased. So if your kid dies, it'd be quite common to get a photograph of your little kid lying, look as though it's sleeping. Could also be a parent or a brother or a sister or something. So it's essentially photographs of the dead, like a very kind of spooky concept to us, but at the time it seemed quite normal for them. It was like the perfect application of photography, because you'd never see that relative again, so it was like a good thing. It was a comfort for you to document them. And in this instance, they're kind of quite literally that they are depictions of little creatures, three-dimensional things in the real world, and they've been squashed onto a two-dimensional plane, so that they become a depiction of pretty much exactly what happens when you make a figurative image, that you take something from the real world and you compress it onto this flat plane. But in this instance, that flattening of the image from the real world just kills them, that squashing, it extinguishes the life from them. So I was trying to make a bit of work about that kind of subject. And also because when you crush the thorax and you break the wings, they explode into like kind of hundreds of thousands of different particles of dust. And this, although it looks insignificant when it's on this scale, when it's blown up to a couple of meters high, suddenly they become like, there's like a whole world in there. There's like galaxies. It's like looking out into the star system. This tiny little finite creature has become this infinite space that you can look into. So there were the few of the ideas that I was thinking about when I was trying to make the works there. Then there's some earlier works, which are little small pictures of me trying to catch fairies on Clapton Pond, which is a filthy little pond in North London. And it was, the whole area was quite run down then, but if the light caught that little pond in a particular way, when I was sitting on the bus going past it, it looked almost quite idyllic, that little place, although everything around it was pretty run down. And so it was like kind of you could escape from the real world in this little idealized setting under the bridge where I took the pictures. And I made pictures of me with a fishing net trying quite ludicrously to catch these little fairies that I'd built and strung up on little bits of cotton. And there was me trying to make pictures about that kind of ridiculous notion of trying to capture the real world and to make it into a picture, and why the real world isn't enough as it is. Why do we have to make a depiction of it? Why do we got to make a picture? It seems to be quite perverse why human beings have that desire to do that. So I wanted to ridicule that a little bit and to ridicule me, who's constantly trying to chase ephemera and to make something out of it when actually you can't do it. You can't really catch a fairy. They exist in the mind and they exist in the imagination. We want them to exist. They're part of our fantasy, but they're not something that are tangible. And the idea that you can actually go out and catch this thing is like a kind of a basic misunderstanding of the notion of fantasy. So that's a little bit about what I wanted to make with those pictures. And then the other little sculptures in that room is like a series that I've been working on for, again, like kind of 20 years or more. Initially I made them, I really feel like I'm repeating myself, so excuse me if you've heard it before, but it's true that I'd read quite a few books and they all seem to be sharing a similar subject matter. I read like poems from Baudelaire, The Fleur de Mal, and a book by J.K. Heisman called Against Nature, and books by Jean Genet, and all of them seem to have quite a strong interest in this morbid attraction to death and disease and sex. And it's like a very unhealthy interest that they had with Baudelaire. It's quite evident from the title of the book of poems itself, The Fleur de Mal, these evil flowers, quite a strange image to conjure. And then with J.K. Heisman, his book, this specific book was about a collector who starts obsessively collecting different things, and he starts to accumulate them in the mansion that he's living in. And he's quite isolated, but he becomes more and more so. He doesn't want to involve himself in the real world at all. His collection becomes more and more obsessive and eccentric until he's only collecting flowers that are just extremely exotic looking, and then so exotic that they all look like they're adorned by these diseases. And I think the whole process of his decay into insanity is about his his pathological removal from the real world, and how this obsession of his is really quite unhealthy. And with the Jean Genet books, he writes, when he's in prison, he writes about his lovers in prison. And although they've got like scars and wounds and pustules all over them, he writes about them as though they're adornments in some way. and he writes very poetically about them, and he describes them as being embellishments on the skin of these men, as though they're like kind of medals that they've been awarded for through going through various fights and battles in their life. And it seemed to me like a very strange and interesting, like amoral take on this thing, that he doesn't judge it on its on the value that most other people would assess these infections and wound with. So I wanted to make something like that, something that skewed your normal rational way of looking at something like a flower. But I also wanted to make pictures of flowers as I thought they actually were, because I got kind of a little bit tired of looking at paintings of flowers where they were like kind of a beautiful lit little tulip with a bit of a dewdrop on the end twinkling away, like the kind of thing you'd find on a little card that says "Get Well, Mum" on it. And it seemed that there's a bit of a cosmetic adaptation of nature, and not the real way that flowers exist. That flowers are actually kind of like sexual predatory creatures, and all they're really interested in is propagating their seed. They're not interested in being popped in a jar and being admired. So I wanted to make some flowers that actually looked like they were these nasty little predatory creatures that could possibly be contaminated by sexual diseases. And there's also the aspect in them as well that they could be flowers that are growing from an earth, a soil that's been poisoned in some way, possibly by us, and that they've been contaminated by our interference with them. They're kind of quite complicated things to make. The first pictures I made were very bad Photoshop collages, where I'd take photographs of flowers, and then I'd take like various books from Foyle's bookshop of horrific tropical diseases, what have you, sexual diseases, and then graft these skin diseases onto the flowers in Photoshop. And then I made some little films with it, and then finally I started making these little models. And I get real flowers, break them down into petals and stalks and leaves, and then make molds for each part of the flower, then cast the molds, and then assemble all the casts, gluing them all back together, and then stick little kind of blisters and pustules on them, and then paint them all up to look slightly flesh-coloured, as though they'd lost their original flower colours, and they'd become like kind of fleshy, predatory creatures. And that's all down here, so it's just the one work upstairs. And that was a work that I originally made to go in a place called Gallery Borghese in Rome. And I asked the gallery itself if I could make an exhibition there, and to my surprise they said I could. So I sort of decided I need to kind of ramp it up a little bit and get a new work in there. I already had an idea for 3 different works, but they gave me a different room downstairs, like a big room. I thought there's got to be something in there, and it's got to be something to do with what else is going on in that room. And the Gallery Borghese is like high Baroque. There's stuff everywhere. There's high camp. There's like frescoes all across the ceiling, and it's like sex and violence going on, and then there's statues popping out of the walls, more violence and sex, paintings on the walls, same subject matter, mosaics on the floor, gladiators fighting, so it's just writhing bodies everywhere. So I thought it should be something that resonates a little bit with that theme, which limited me a little bit, but they also have a painting in that gallery which is of the Massacre of the Innocents, and I thought that might be a good subject matter, because it's a painting that's been repeatedly made throughout art history. It's also a subject matter for many plays, particularly in medieval times. Apparently, it was one of the most popular subject matter that people used to enjoy seeing at the theatre, and they would like get pig bladder full of blood, and then on stage they'll burst these pig's bladder open, and the first few rows would be showered in blood, and they loved it. Couldn't get enough of it. And a similar thing with the painting. There must be a reason why that subject matter has been repeated so often. People are kind of really quite engaged and fascinated by looking at a subject like that. Anyway, it occurred to me when I was looking at these paintings that unlike a lot of other paintings in the gallery, which are like portraits or pictures of a little guy playing a kind of a lyre or something, that in the depictions of the Massacre of the Innocents, there's no real focal point there. And the design of the painting is such that it keeps your eye moving around. There's no place to fix your gaze on, because you like follow a leg down here, there's an arm there, so you go up there, then it's across the torso, and then down another arm. And your eye is constantly going around, and it kind of creates like a mild form of anxiety in you, because you never really fix on one particular thing. You're always being drawn onto something else. There's so many naked bodies everywhere. And so the painter is in a way recreating or trying to recreate that emotional turmoil that you might have experienced when you were looking at that scene in the first place. So it's a technical device used to reawaken or to awaken those kind of thoughts and feelings in your mind. So I decided to make it in the form of a three-dimensional zoetrope. It's a more evolved version of a Victorian toy, which most of you are probably familiar with. Is essentially a cylinder that's got little slits in it. And if you look through those little slits as it revolves, there's generally like a little drawing or a photograph in there, and it might be like a little clown throwing balls up and down. And there are different frames all the way around, but when it spins, you have the illusion of animation, and it's like a pre-cinematic device. It's the kind of stuff they were up to in the evening before we had TV, but it led to cinema. It's basically increments in movement inside single frames, which when run together give us the moving image. So this was all happening just before cinema took off. It's something that's interested me a lot for years. This technique that I've used is pretty much the same thing, but I'm using three-dimensional models, and I'm using, instead of the little slot that you look through, the slot is essentially the shutter. In a projector it'd be a shutter. I'm using a stroboscopic light, so every time a little figure passes in front of you, the light flashes, so you see it for a fraction of a second. The work then turns an 18th by 1/18th, and you see the next little figure, which is slightly different, and the light flashes again, and that's your next little frame in the animation. There are a lot more complications that go into making a work like that, and from the design to completion of the execution of it took like a year, so there's a lot of mistakes made along the way, and a lot of the time it's trying to find practical solutions to a technical problem that can also add something to the experience of the work. So I could have, for example, a guy doing a particular thing which looks like he should be doing that thing, but maybe the reason I've got him doing that thing is that it disguises something else. There's all kind of little tricks and illusions that you have to play in there, which are essentially part of the kind of sleight of hand that goes on. Anyway, it's something that interests me, that the way the word's made is a technical solution to a practical problem, but it also elicits something from you when you look at it. Anyway, so the final work was designed to be, there's about 300 figures inside a tempietto, which is a small temple. For like weeks, I struggled with the architecture to house all these little figures that I was designing. And first I had like a tree, and then I had some vaulted arches, and none of them were particularly satisfactory. And in a visit to Rome, to go to Borghese on like a little recce, I passed Bramante's temple, which is kind of quite a miniature temple, and suddenly thought, well, that's absolutely perfect, because what you need for that particular technology is to have a shape that repeats itself, in my case 18 times, and so it doesn't look unusual when it repeats itself 18 times, and the temple was the perfect form to do that. So once I had that, I got my form and I could start putting my little figures inside there. I was going to say something about a temple. Yeah. Anyway, it was possibly not historically accurate because Bethlehem, apparently, possibly in the time when Herod sent his men out to execute all the male children under the age of 2 years old, Bethlehem probably had a population of about 1,000 people, which means little males under the age of 2, there's probably about 30 of them anyway, and there certainly wouldn't have been any classical temples in that village at the time. But most of the painters who have made pictures of that subject matter strangely do seem to have classical ruins in the background, and I guess the only explanation is that it's like a device in the same way that I use devices. It's just a device to make, so subconsciously you're registering it in the back of your mind because it's about like the kind of, it's ransacking something that was pure and like this classical structure, which is like mostly the pinnacle of man's performance in designing, about our achievements with architecture and design, and it was being like kind of laid waste by these kind of psycho-crazed murderers who are killing the kids under 2 years old. So although it's not historically accurate, it's a device that's used in the painting, so it was good enough for me. And I wanted to make this work that basically you walk into the room, you see this carnage going on in front of you, but your first response is to be quite engaged and even charmed and amused by it, and then you realize what's going on, but it's kind of like too late. You're already kind of complicit in like this thing that you're witnessing before you, and you're kind of enjoying the whole tension and violence that's going on. The Master of the Innocents is something that plays off this multiplicity of figures in the way that hopefully my work upstairs does. Generally with a zoetrope you have to repeat things multiple times to make the animation work. There's very few subjects you can pull that repetition off with, but with the Mask of the Innocents it's a subject that capitalizes on that, like kind of that orgy of violence that's happening. So the more bodies, the better. It just makes it more effective at kind of confusing your eye and drawing your eye into that confusion and being entertained by it. So essentially I wanted to make a work that was about that ongoing thing of genocide that happens, of man's cruelty to man, something that's been in art since the beginning and something that's been in civilization since the beginning and is still going on now around the world. And it's that like cycle of violence that gets passed on down through the ages. And it's become also like this carousel of entertainment which we experience and enjoy through originally drawings, paintings, sculptures, now TV, video games, the internet. It's all part of the entertainment system that we know. It's about trying to tie those things together. So I don't want to go on too much about it. I think I've probably said enough about all the works here. I don't know what the time is like. Are we kind of...
Well, at this point then, shall we thank Matt first of all for a really good work.
Thank you.
We can now open up to questions. If people have got questions that they'd like to ask Matt or myself or anybody. Yes, over here.
Did you ever get to ask the prisoners why they chose their name?
Sorry, what?
Did you ever get to choose the last meal? Did you actually get to ask any prisoners why they chose what they were eating?
No, I do get asked that quite a lot, and I feel guilty that I don't. That everything I did was basically, I was a long way away. I was at home reading a book or just online finding out that information. So I cross-reference everything to make sure that my information was correct, but I didn't go to any of the jails, so I didn't have any direct contact with them at all. I mean, I didn't think the work needed that kind of integrity that somebody described to me what they were going to have. Most of these things are from America. I made a couple of other ones which were like kind of like Adolf Eichmann I did, so he was executed in Israel. Most of them from America, but I didn't go to any of the prisons. It's possible that I could have done that, but the logistics of actually making it happen seemed very complex and to me not really necessary. I don't think I was any more morally dubious than I already am through getting the information from other sources rather than... Yeah, a lot of different states have different laws about what you can actually have as well. Like some states are more generous than others. Some places, they'll pop out for sushi for you, where other people just say you can only have what's in the kitchen today. And there was like in Texas, which this is like these are all made in Texas, these last meal series, which is now kind of out of date because there was a white supremacist several years ago and he ordered a banquet. He got everything on there, sweet, savoury, the whole lot. And when it came round to the last meal, just before execution, he was like, yeah, you know what, I'm not hungry. And they're like, you're kidding, you got to be kidding, man. Like, we've really put ourselves out here. And they're like, okay, that's it. We're not doing it anymore. So now, in the state of Texas, you can't get a last meal on death row because of this white supremacist guy. It's got to be artist, really, which sounds a little kind of pretentious, but I can't barely operate a camera. My painting is probably not up to scratch. So I slip between all the stalls, really, and I've never really particularly wanted to do one over the other. It's like, for me, if I have a subject that I want to make a work with, then I try and find the best way of making it breathe, of bringing it to life, of making it work. And that could be anything, could be painting, it could be like kind of Lego, it could be plasticine, could be whatever, but it's got to be right. So for me, they seem pretty antiquated, that, you know, people did painting because it was the best way of making an image in the 15th century or stuff. If they had like kind of digital cameras, I'm pretty sure they would have used them. At the time, it was the most advanced means of making an image, and carving with marble was like a sensible way of making a work that would last. It was beautiful with its surface. So I think there are practical, functional, historical reasons why certain traditions evolve. And I find it strange when somebody becomes like a painter. It's like a tradition that was appropriate for a particular time, and like now seems like it's like a Vietnamese like a soldier that's still in the forest like for like 50 years, 30, 40, 50 years after the war, still fighting a battle that's been fought and won or lost, whatever. But so for me, I don't want to specialise in a particular medium. It's just whatever the subject matter kind of dictates to me that it should be expressed in. I'm doing something with virtual reality, weirdly, which is a project that I never particularly wanted to work with because I always thought it was a bit too gimmicky, and I don't like actually having to go into an exhibition, actually put earphones on or anything, any of that. I hate all that. Or go into a room that's got a narrative video on. I don't like any of that. I like to come and see, like, it could be 1 second or it could be an hour you spend looking at it. I like that, and the fact you don't touch anything. But Pete James, who's here tonight, had an idea, and we decided that it would be a great subject matter to make with virtual reality. And it's going back to a time. So it's about the history of photography. It's about the history of visual images and how they change the way we look at the world. So rather than making just like a weird magical forest, I'm not trying to go into future fantasy. I'm trying to go back in time to some more primitive technology. Virtual reality, we're on this whole threshold of this total immersion in this illusionary world that's going to happen big time in the next few years. But our project is taking us back into the past when photography was a very new thing, and that itself was as weird then as virtual reality is now. So that's one of a few projects that I'm doing that's totally new to me.
Awesome. Yeah.
As a second year art student, I'm curious to know what sort of work you created and were interested in while studying art, and how it's progressed into what's around us now.
Porn, maybe. In my second year it was. Because I wanted to make things that were like kind of unacceptable in a way. It's like, he's making nice paintings, he's making nice sculptures, nice photographs. It's like, what is unacceptable? It's like I wanted to make work, you know, when you get like a teenage girl's bedroom and there's pictures of horses on the wall, like My New Pony kind of thing. I wanted to make work that you had that kind of relationship to, that wasn't academic and wasn't part of the art canon. It was something that was like it's a human relation that you had to that thing, and you couldn't let anything else get in the way of it. So it was like a blasphemy, and it was a transgression from normal subjects of art. And also, it's just like, it's kind of like with virtual reality, porn is by far the biggest investor in pushing that medium forward. And with magazines and all that kind of stuff, they're always at the forefront of this technology. Like the color and the quality of those magazines back in the 1980s were, you know, probably as good as, if not better than, Art Forum or the magazines, because that's where all the money is, ironically. And so it was just something about that, the weirdness, how you could have that like super high-tech representation of the real world, but it was about a subject matter that was so debased and so crude and so non-intellectual. I was interested in that kind of paradox of how advanced the technology was and how primitive the subject matter was. So that and medical books as well, which again was like, you know, just horrific stories of, you know, pilots who had crashed, and you see their body, and then further down the runway there was the brain, and you go on and like 12 feet there's an eyeball a little bit further on. So those kind of things which were just, they had an immediacy about them and a connection to us as human beings that something like Agnes Martin, for example, didn't have.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I totally do. Like, kind of, it's always going on. So I like to have like a few projects, like 3 or 4 projects at the same time. Then when I hit a wall, get stuck, I go on to another project that I'm working on, then the same thing to another one, and then keep moving around, and like step by step, each one slowly gathers. Oh yeah, well, most of it. I think surely most artists do. I don't know. For me, I kind of cringe. Like, this is just like, the whole thing is illusion, because most of what I do is horrible. No, because they've staged it so well. They've like kind of, like.
It's all down to us.
Yeah, it's all lighting. It's all like smoke and mirrors, and just like kind of presenting in a way that makes it look as good as it can do. But yeah, I shiver to think of. But I think that's a good thing if you're not. Basically, you learn a lot more from your failures than you do from your successes. That's like an old thing, but it's totally true. When you do something and it's rubbish and it's wrong and it's bad, it's like, well, I'm not going to do that again. And why is it wrong? How can I make it not wrong? Whereas if you do something right, generally you don't really know what it is that it's right that you've done, and then you become a bit deluded and think you're good when you're actually not. Because to get that thing right, you actually struggled quite a lot, and you went through a lot of different technical problems, but you forget all about that when it's done. You forget the struggle, you just think, I'm a genius, I did something great. Whereas if you do something wrong, you're really going to wake up and pay attention and address that issue. But yeah, I always come back to like the squash butterflies. I'm always, every couple of years, I come back and make maybe a little increment on it, pick it up and then take it a little bit further. It's nice to have things to go back to that you can constantly add to.
Oh, there's 2. This lady and then Barbara after that. So.
Quite random, really, and there's just there's scans, not photographs, which is how, because I was skint when I was making them. Like, to take a photograph is kind of quite expensive, and particularly a photograph of that quality is very pricey. But with those images, I could just like get like loads of them. You can buy them, by the way, online. They come from like China, little envelopes. I squashed them on my scanner, and then you scan them in, and it's just free. And you can scan such high resolution, you can zoom in like 1,000,000 times, and there's still detail in there. But after that, I made like 100 scans, like kind of squashed another one, squashed that one, turned it over, scan. After about 100 scans, one has got a little bit of promise in it. It's like there's something there that, most of them are rubbish, but then one has a little bit of something, and then over weeks, I like flip it to the left, flip it up, flip it down, take a bit out, put a bit back in, and generally like a kind of a character starts to emerge, and then you just kind of nurse it and just like add little bits, and then you add a bit and it doesn't work, so you take it out again. And then at some point it just seems to have its own life independent of you, and it's kind of at that point it's finished. It's its own little figure. I mean, a lot of them are quite anthropomorphic. There's like kind of heads and bodies and like legs, or not really. Always pretty random. Everything's just random, and then through that randomness, somehow, through like thousands of different choices, an order will emerge. But that order is to do with kind of like a composition that works, and subconsciously it reminds us of certain shapes that we recognize, like the human form, or just various things, just things that work formally. Yeah, like on eBay and stuff, you can just buy. I like to say yes, and I kill them as I make the image, but no, they're like kind of, they're dead when they arrive. Yeah.
You can buy anything off the internet, I think, nowadays.
Yeah.
Barbara?
It was pretty quick actually. But I've done it like 3 times, and I did it over like 4 years. I did 3 different series. But I had a little system going because I live in an old pub, and my son is quite a good cook, and we've still got the dumb waiter in the pub. So my studio is downstairs where the bar would be. So I have my camera set up there, my little table and my lights. Then he's up in the kitchen. And I could just like bang on the door and say like kind of cheeseburger and fries with like Coca-Cola, and he'd like knock them out with a tea towel over his shoulder kind of thing. Put them in the dumbwaiter, bang on it, come down, photograph it, put it back in. So we had like a little system going. So we did the whole thing in I don't know, about 4 or 5 hours or something. But I took lots of different photographs of each different one, just like rotating a chip 4 degrees and then squirting a bit of ketchup and like taking it off again. So then I finished up with like thousands of different pictures and had to go through them, picking ones which I thought worked. And even then there was like stuff like, you know, a bit of like gaffer tape in the background, so you got to black that out, and a bit of tape that I'd used to tape a bit of cheese onto the side of a bun. Remove that. So there's a lot of kind of like post-production as well, which is not evident in the pictures. So pretty quick in the actual execution, but a few different series I did. So they happen pretty quick when you're doing them, and then a little bit of post-production. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's quite slow. It's like about 3 months of me going through just getting the information, printing it out, and then cross-referencing it and finding out which ones. Because a lot of it contradicts. You go online and look for Gary Gilmore, what he had on Last Meal on Death Row, and people say he has whiskey, somebody else said he had coffee. So you've got to be a little bit careful about which sources you're taking. And I use books as well. So once I've established that it seems that that's quite likely what they had, because everybody's saying the same thing, then they'll become part of my list, and then I just be going through. Just good to like kind of just absorb it. You don't even really know. It's not like a conscious thing. It's just, it's in your head, and then gradually you're thinking steak and chips seems like a good option, or I like the lobster idea, kind of thing. But I didn't rush to a conclusion of choices. I just let it kind of. I absorbed all the menus, and then kind of let them choose themselves. So it's about 3 months or something before starting to making the actual choices.
Yes.
A lot of your work is really quite evocative in terms of thought. Is that something that you always set out to do, or intentionally do, or is it just something that happens when you're working?
I think originally it was like kind of, I love art anyway, and I love going to galleries. I don't really mind what it is. I just love it, that kind of engagement. But at the time, like in the mid-80s when I was going to galleries, I'd go and see work which I felt was indifferent to me. It'd be like a sculpture of a bottle top, like a plastic Coke top kind of thing, made 4 foot wide, on the floor. It's quite a good sculpture. But I felt like it wasn't really like engaging me. It didn't give a shit what I thought about it. It was impervious to anything I could project onto it. And for me, that was kind of slightly insulting that I was isolated like that. So I thought, mistakenly, that it'd be a compliment to people coming to see the work if there's something that really engaged them, whether it's pornography or images from forensic pathology books and stuff. It was just shit. That is, you know, that is something we can recognise of the real life we live in. It's not esoteric. It's real. So it wasn't really so much of a shock. It's just, you know, that's kind of what I grew up with, that kind of interest in visual media, that had that kind of charge and potency to us. And then it seems weird to go into the art world and suddenly making kind of really highbrow kind of abstract art with like kind of geometrical lines in it. It's like, well, for 20 years during my childhood and teenager, I've been, my source material is all, you know, as well as like comics and various other magazines and publications. It's all been about stuff that really grabs me visually, as did a lot of in the history of painting. You know, David and Goliath or Salome and like all these images, these great beautiful paintings, a lot of them are charged with a lot of sex and violence. It's there in art history. So it didn't seem that strange to be choosing them.
I think, was there one more question over here? Yes, shall we take this question and then we'll roll up? Okay.
Oh.
Why not?
Well, the truth behind magicians is, of course, that they've probably been in jail for one, or they've got no mates, because they've had far much too time on their hands to spend practicing and perfecting sleight of hand. You know, that's what magic's about, isn't it? It's designed to look effortless and seamless and magic, but it's all about certain diversionary tactics. Okay, you're talking about supernatural magic. You're talking about real. Okay, right, like an intuitive type thing. I think like your brain's a little bit like a computer, and that you're constantly absorbing information and putting it in a lot of different sections of your mind, and you've just got all that information there ready for you. We do use that information all the time, and so when I'm making a decision about an artwork, it's just like I kind of know like that this is the way to go. And I could be wrong, but you've got to trust your instincts to an extent, keep a rein on them, but kind of trust what your mind's telling you, because generally you'll think, if you like kind of, oh, I like fancy an orange juice, maybe an orange juice is a good idea. And like the same thing with me making choices about what I want to work with. It's like I'm primed for something that I assume is quite an interesting thing because I'm interested in it. But actually realizing it, technically making it happen, is all the smoke and mirrors of creating magic. You're creating illusion for somebody so that they don't really see how you're making them think that thing that they're thinking. Although I do also like to reveal the mechanism sometimes, like with the work upstairs, where you can actually see an illusion being generated in front of your eyes. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for all your questions. Is there any more burning questions? And if not, I'm going to draw things to a close.
Yeah, I've got
No.
one.
Could you? Right.
It is a work that epitomises you as an artist, because I know your work's a lot about depth and things like that. As your single legacy, do you think which one to choose?
And the whole exhibition, do you think? It's a good question to end on.
Well, Valdemar called the Zoetrope nothing less than a contemporary masterpiece.
Yeah, I like that one in there,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
I like that one in there.
The
Probably
other
because it's
ones,
like it's intangible as well, so you can't really kind of own it as an object. It's always disappearing from you. So yeah, I go for that one.
hard one.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Some really engaging and interesting questions there. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I do hope you'll come back again to see the show again and again. And If we could all join together in thanking Matt for a really fantastic share.
Thank you very much. Thank you.